With He-Man Revolution just around the corner, I wanted to take a look back at He-Man Revelation. Whoever decided to name these two series in such a similar fashion deserves to be locked up alongside whoever named the Planet of the Apes reboot trilogy. The response to this show has been split, to say the least. I wanted to balance out the discourse, as I actually enjoyed the show quite a lot. It's not perfect by any means, and I'll definitely share my own complaints, but overall I think the show delivered something rather unexpected and pretty damn cool. This He-Man series is meant to act as both a reboot and sequel to the original 80s cartoon. It seems to discount and ignore any other installments entirely. How's it going, everyone? My name's Graham and welcome to Two Left Thumbs. I grew up with the original show and would call myself a fan, but not a die-hard of any sort. I haven't seen every episode, I'm not a collector, I at most had one or two of the toys, but boy oh boy did I love tuning in for some muscle-headed super characters and their light-hearted banter and PSAs. This world was unique and weird and campy and so delightfully of its time. And with that last piece in mind specifically, I never really thought bringing back this franchise was worthwhile at all. But I was won over and convinced to give this a shot based on the involvement of Powerhouse Animation Studios, an all-star cast taking up the mantle, with a list of names so big that a heavy hitter like Kevin Conroy was left voicing Seaman, Merman, and nerd lord Kevin Smith seemingly coming at the show from a place of genuine love and personal fandom. That felt like a great pairing of IP and producer. A nerd who was a teen when this show first aired in the 80s, revitalizing it for a new audience? I was all in. Although that excitement was temporarily replaced by confusion when three new things used the same needle drop in the span of 1 week. How does that happen? Anyways, that felt like a winning recipe, and I couldn't really pass it up. I didn't plan to go in with a critical eye, but about halfway through episode 1, it was clear to me I was gonna have a lot to say. As a little tidbit, I have a Let's Play channel, Graham Games, go check it out, why not? That uses the He-Man logo and theme as its main inspiration. I don't know why this show has left such an impression on me, but it stood out in my mind for so many years, and I still have unbelievably fond memories of growing up with Masters of the Universe. I'm actually reworking a pair of videos, moving them over to this channel ahead of the premiere of He-Man Revolution. As is evidenced by those original thumbnails, you can maybe tell that I really enjoyed Revelation. I'm thrilled to see this story continue. As I bring these two videos together, I'll be tweaking things along the way, but I will still keep my reviews of Part 1 and Part 2 separate. For one, that still matches how Netflix originally released them, and my opinion does somewhat differ between Part 1 and 2. But I'm also doing it that way because it would just be far too much work to rewrite those videos and fully merge my opinions. I want to start by addressing something fairly specific that may help you decide whether or not this show is worth your time, before knowing much else about it. Who is this for? I see a lot of people asking this, and in many ways, I think the answer is me. Like I said, I grew up watching reruns of the original 80s cartoon. I never saw the 2002 He-Man, and haven't seen the new She-Ra reboot. I am a very narrow, very specific audience member who I think is primed to get the most out of this series. I'm old enough to remember the source material, but young enough to succumb to the nostalgia hits this show is offering. Smith and crew touted that the show would be accessible to fans of the original series and newcomers alike. And if you ask me, that simply isn't true. They take the story in new directions that you could potentially follow along with, but I think the highs of this show were really contingent on at least partially knowing the source material. As a young, adultish white man, so much stuff is made for my exact demographic, and I think this is no different. The original version had a PSA at the end of every episode teaching children to be better.
Remember, it's your body and no one should touch you in a way that you feel is wrong.
If you've been touched that way, don't be ashamed. Tell someone you trust, like your parents, or your minister or rabbi.
And a sword-wielding muscle man who wasn't allowed to actually hit bad guys or really use his weapons at all. Whereas this one had murder and violence aplenty. It's not gory, but if you're a parent looking to introduce your kids to the world of Eternia you grew up with, I'm genuinely sorry, but the show wasn't really made with kids or newcomers of any kind in mind. That may seem totally at odds with the source, but it wouldn't be the first time that we took an old children's property and made it something that me and my fellow white 20 to 30 somethings would enjoy.
Fuck Batman.
I'm going to avoid specific spoilers for now, but I can totally get why people are mad at Kevin Smith. Giving a bit of context to that fan outrage, and a major reason why the show was so negatively received. Seeing the way he's been pitching the show for years and telling fans it'll be He-Man oriented. I know he wanted to keep the actual direction of the show a secret, but many feel that they were misled, with He-Man simply being used as a marketing tool. I think if the show were marketed more honestly, fan reception would have been far more positive. They really used nostalgia to lure people in, then pulled a big bait and switch. If you would have been following the development of this show for years, you're likely rather rightfully mad about that manipulation. As someone who completely ignored the show until the day it came out, I had no expectations, and had the pleasant surprise of a new twist on a familiar property. But really, I kind of disagree with all of this. Yeah, I understand that the show hasn't gone in the direction that fans were expecting. But if they wanted to have any form of effective twist, Kevin Smith did kinda have to lie to you. You are assuming that the second half of the show won't be He-Man oriented, and it almost certainly will be. I'm calling it now. I exist in some weird, precise limbo, where I have a fondness for the original series and strong memories of it, but no major fandom for it. For me, it's always been this sit back and enjoy, point and laugh, goofy adventure. But if they would have made 20 more episodes of that, I probably wasn't gonna watch. So I don't feel betrayed at all with this reinvention of it. So again, who is this show for? If you either don't know the original series at all, or are a super fan of either the 80s or early 2000s versions, I would assume you are much less likely to enjoy Revelations. So I'd love to discuss parts of this show that genuinely do work for me. Things from the actual show, not just the conversation surrounding it. Celebrating the old. Let's be honest here, the original show was a commercial. That's it, that's how it started. They set out to make 65 episodes in the first season, airing them 5 days a week because they wanted immediate syndication and to sell you a product. I know the show turned out better than it had any right to be, but I don't think I was actually that interested in a show that followed that same format. They were mapping it out in this formulaic way with one hand tied behind their back, because they always had to introduce the new toy, restore the status quo, and create some more than easily digestible TV. And that's fine. They weren't trying to make some intellectual, long-running series, and now Revelations is making the show for a more mature audience. And that cookie-cutter style would have gotten old very quickly. Creating an actual running narrative is the simplest and best thing they could have done with this property. Just like on day one, when all the producers are in a room together, and they're deciding what they want the series to be. The smartest thing anyone could have said is, what if we presented the show with a running, ongoing storyline? That alone was a good reason to make this show. With the series acting as a direct sequel to the original, they made sure the first episode feels like a series finale, turning the Battle of Grayskull into an all-out war, far larger than anything we've seen. Skeletor is pulling his usual tricks, schemes, and double fakes to gain entrance to the castle. It all feels familiar. You're waiting for them to do the fake out on the fake out and realize the good guys have the upper hand. But they were really upping the ante in ways we've never seen before. You start to realize it's not going to go the way you're predicting. This is solidified by Skeletor going psycho and actually killing a minor character. It was an amazing thing to see a series with no real continuity suddenly being handled in a way where the stakes aren't just large, but that there were stakes at all. That's totally new to this universe. The episode doesn't end with a reset to the normal, but an entirely redefined status quo. I'm not sure I really like the weird way the lore of Grayskull itself gets retconned to feel insubstantial, when it has always kind of been a centerpiece of the series, but I suppose it matters less when the goal is to break that mold and move the characters around more of Eternia rather than locking them in one place, exclusively defending one stronghold. So removing that center of mysticism makes sense from that perspective, but it's all the power of Grayskull. I suppose that's unchanged, but it was a little sad to see the actual castle tweaked in that way. It's interesting, but it's a slight disrespect to the source material. So on that point specifically, I'm a little 50-50. I haven't really seen other people say if they liked or hated that. I would guess they disliked it. I personally really like the commitment to staying true to the original character designs, matching the colors, the general shapes, and silhouettes. Seeing slightly altered versions of the silly 80s camp, like He-Man's ridiculous hair and pink leotard, was great to see. You really can't get rid of those elements. While this animation team had already given us their version of these original costumes, later in the series we get to see maybe how they would have designed them starting nearly from scratch, but only after doing the originals first and making sure there are really direct links between the old and new. I love how faithfully that was done, and it was kind of needed, so that was a really great way to go about it. From the character design straight through to the literal animation, I don't know how anyone could think this show was done with anything other than love for the original series. I don't know how closely people pay attention to this, but I've always, even before attempting any animation of my own, found the recycled and reused animation loops in this show hilarious. They have to really bend over backwards sometimes to make sure it fits. And there were some exact one-to-ones in the animation, mimicking what was done back in the 80s in ways that's pure fan service, and it was so fun to see. We've seen those same rotoscoped poses and frames 100 times over, and suddenly we're seeing them again, totally reimagined. To pay tribute to and update that in a way that I'm sure they wished they could have done 40 years ago is pretty special. I think that added a lot for me personally. And while I'm not overly familiar with all the deeper lore that they laced into the mini-comics or through other means, I can appreciate the instances where they stayed true to that as much as possible. I don't recall the Power Sword being made of two halves ever being significant to the old show itself, but someone clearly did their research and maintained that bit of series canon. I think that really highlights how affectionately this show was made and that the writers were fans first. So I felt they carried a very genuine and apparent love for the show, and what better way to show that than with great casting and really selling those performances in ways that adds some weight and drama to these cartoonish characters. In a fun bit of layered fan service, and yes, I do think this show genuinely took the fans into consideration. Alan Oppenheimer actually has a cameo in this episode as the ancient being, Moss Man.
Go and get them, Grass Man!
Quickly, Bowstar! Hit him with the stun ray!
No, not quite that.
You defile the heart of Grayskull with your very presence.
Which then in this whole ironic full circle scene is directly killed off by Mark Hamill's Skeletor. That's really cool. While we're on the subject of voice acting carrying these mantles, I have a perfect segue. I want to dedicate a section to one of the inarguable strengths of this series, before sharing a few criticisms and then dedicating the rest of the video with what I genuinely liked about it. I'm purposely structuring that to create a bit of a positivity sandwich here. I don't want to dwell on the negatives, and I can't ignore them, but they didn't, in my mind, define the experience. So we're making sure to mostly stay positive. I'll start touching on light spoilers in this section, but nothing that will ruin your ability to go into the series near blind still. I think Chris Wood did a solid job with Adam. And He-Man. There isn't a lot to comment on here. His presence was simply downplayed, and not given much opportunity to shine. There was enough time there for me to recognize that it wasn't a miscast. He certainly isn't weighing the show down, but we haven't seen enough to see if he brings anything new or special to the role. Mark Hamill as Skeletor is as incredible as I assumed it would be. I just love his voice acting so much in pretty well anything. He has defined the Joker for me since I was a child. He's single-handedly the reason that Hobgoblin is one of my favorite Spider-Man villains. So having him now redefine an important childhood character feels so well realized. I genuinely think his casting was maybe their only option. I've watched clips of the 2002 show, and it does nothing for me.
Pretend? Who's pretending? I am nice, in thought and in deed.
That original voice is so distinct. It would be a disservice to try to imitate it. It's incredibly hard to update. Hamill gave us an homage to that original while making it wholly his own.
When are you goody-goody fools going to understand? I am completely and utterly evil. I live to be bad.
Because while we are different in so many ways, we share one thing in common. Our hatred of He-Man.
I actually still haven't even seen the 80s Dolph Lundgren live-action He-Man movie, but I've also seen clips of that, and it's interesting to hear the similarity between Mark Hamill's Skeletor and what Frank Langella did in the live-action movie.
And I have waited so very long for this moment.
Lena Headey as Evil Lynn is an amazing pickup. She elevates every role she takes, and I have no idea how they got her on board for this. Maybe she's not hamming it up quite enough at first. These characters are goofy and boisterous, but I think she was clearly having audible fun getting into this cartoonish character, and she really shines as the character transitions through the season. Neutral Lynn just doesn't have the same ring to it, but that was maybe where Lena did some of her best work. As someone who also grew up with Buffy the Vampire Slayer and is actively rewatching the show just for my own enjoyment, still debating if I want to do like a full series retrospective on that, hearing Sarah Michelle Gellar as Teela is super exciting. I don't even know if that's the best match for the character, but I think I really liked it. You know, in the early episodes, I kind of thought, is that just a big name grab for the sake of it? Could someone else have probably done a better job with it? I certainly thought so at first. It was hard to wrap my head around, since the Teela I knew was overly polite and formal. Still a competent fighter, but despite her courage and strong moral compass, was treated as somewhat clueless. I'm used to Sarah Michelle Gellar being bubbly, but overly sarcastic.
What are you doing?
Breaking into your office and going through your private files.
I'm calling the police.
And pretty intense, as we saw more of her character in this series, and better understood the jaded angle they were playing up, Sarah Michelle Gellar stood out as a great casting choice. But this character really only shares a name with that original Teela, and that really is the only way that this casting would have ever worked. I imagine that complete character rewrite could have put some fans off. I feel for Griffin Newman trying to fill the shoes of Orko. He did a fairly good job imitating that original voice, but the performance felt too restrained.
Hey, you wouldn't pull that if Prince Adam was here.
I think that might be more of a direction choice rather than any indication of his own acting ability. Maybe the overly cartoonish, silly physical comedy weirdo of the old cartoon wouldn't fit the tone of Revelations. The character seems just a little lifeless to me, both in voice and animation. I didn't like their half-hearted interpretation of the old humor he brought to the show. Yeah, it was humor made for 4-year-olds, but in their effort to swerve around that, they kind of made this humor that doesn't appeal to anyone. Adults can laugh at childish humor when it's obvious that's what they're going for. Beyond episode 1, where they tried to balance the old and new, I enjoyed the performance for Orko a little more, but I have some other complaints with the character I'll have to save for later. One of the biggest standouts, and maybe biggest waste, was Stephen Root as Cringer. Root is always great, and we needed more of what he offered. This character is basically Scooby-Doo if he were a green tiger. His defining trait is simply that he's scared of everything. What Root and the writers did to add depth to Cringer was simply amazing. I saw someone point out how they used the character's meekness to give him the perspective to see both sides and diffuse a bad situation. It's him using his weakness to his advantage, and navigate it in such a satisfying way. He's quiet, loyal, level-headed, and prefers finding a non-violent solution, not relying on his battle cat alter ego. If that's how they plan to handle Cringer, I want that little guy in every episode. Liam Cunningham as Man-at-Arms is perfect. That's all there is to it. In some way, it almost feels too on the nose, but I still think it's a good thing. The cast being lined with big names like Diedrich Bader, Alicia Silverstone, Kevin Michael Richardson, Kevin Conroy, Henry Rollins, Susan Eisenberg, Tony Todd, Justin Long, and Phil Lamar is amazing to see. Maybe that's the Kevin Smith name at work, being able to assemble so many big names even for bit parts. The voice work nearly top to bottom is a major sell point of this series. They knock that out of the park. I have some light criticizing sprinkled here and there, but I'm mostly focusing on the good over the bad. I would like to have a dedicated section here where I really pull things apart and focus more on the negative than the positive. This show was not perfect. In fact, they had a lot of stuff I didn't like. And so without watching those other criticism videos out there, because I didn't want them to affect my own opinion, I'm going to imagine we mostly agree on the same things, and there are like 1 or 2 major points that tip these other people into receiving this show more negatively. There were just a few subjective personal things that lifted me towards overall positive. But we've got to be real, the show needed some work. I've gushed, now I need to step back and kind of dump on things for a little bit. There are grievances that need airing, and through this, I will be spoiling actual meaningful plot points. So this is the first point in the video where I feel a spoiler warning is truly needed. From here on out, viewer beware. I'll try and organize these somewhat, but I'm mostly just going for it. The season is being split into 2 parts. I kind of wonder if it should have been split into 3, maybe not released in 3 parts, as that would have been very annoying as a viewer, but simply structured into 3 major arcs. These 5 episodes feel as though they maybe should have been something like episode 4 through 9. These hypothetical first 3 episodes should have more greatly expanded that ultimate showdown of He-Man and Skeletor. Then it'd feel like the old series was being paid more mind and wrapped up like a major movie event, not something rushed and crammed into 20 minutes. Then, through that faithful send-off, which they did give, I simply wanted more of it, easing people in, we could better develop how and where these characters diverge from that source material. Then we'd have the series we already do have, following these old characters on their new adventure in a changed Eternia, continuing forward as they clearly already have planned. I'm not that worried about where these last 5 episodes go. I think it's pretty obvious they're going to be the most exciting episodes of the series, and it's really going to come down to how well they stick to the landing, and if they set things up in a way that's going to feel worth tuning into after a season 1. I really like what they're doing here, but I think there was major whiplash as a viewer. The show felt entirely familiar, then all at once spin things around, and you're left playing too much catch-up. It simply needed a few more episodes of breathing room to reacquaint ourselves. I liked this new interpretation of Teela, but I think how they got there was poorly earned. She immediately decides she hates everything and storms off.
I'm done looking out for the people who never told me the truth.
As a completely different person. A few more episodes would have greatly helped steer that landing. It felt more like her stating how she changed rather than showing us. In those hypothetical extra 3 episodes, we could have clueless Teela in episode 1, have her learn in episode 2.
What if I called on the power of Grayskull while I'm already in this form?
What do you mean in this form?
Attempt to come to terms with that as best as possible, and in episode 3, come to the conclusion that they didn't value her as much as they should have. In the existing 5 episodes, we have this arc with Scare Glow, at which point she states that she's conquered her fear and that her fear is now one of her powers. What a missed opportunity to show us something really unique and develop the character more meaningfully. The counter to this is how Evil Lynn's character was handled, but I'll save that for a positive section of the video. Here's a negative of rather critical importance. I think the show did a pretty poor job straddling the line of taking itself more seriously while trying to remain fun. Someone interpreted a He-Man anime for a more mature audience as everything is dark, horrible, and hopeless. Whoever made that call seemingly wanted every character to be depressing and every plot beat to be life or death. In 2.5 hours of runtime, there are like 3 jokes. I think I could specifically point out every moment that got a decent chuckle from me. There's a random moment in episode 3 where Skeletor is interrupted discussing what color he wants to paint the ship.
What if we painted the ship a nice granite?
Then after, no attention is paid to it. That sort of goofiness and simplicity from this madman, juxtaposed with his wild over-the-topness, is so funny. If you didn't want characters cracking jokes, surely there were more opportunities to more subtly laugh at the series and kind of flirt with that self-awareness of how absurd it all really is. In episode 5, there is a crazy old sorceress lady who joins the conversation by just babbling nonsense.
Give her space.
It was so unexpected and cut to her as if she was about to add to the conversation. It's such a quick gag that it took a minute to register for me, especially considering the show doesn't joke that much. In that same episode, the main hero assumes Roberto's name would be Metal Man.
That's very clever, Metal Man.
With characters like Merman, Beastman, He-Man, this guy just assumes Roberto will instead be named with the same descriptive format. That's great. That's the sort of in-world self-awareness I'm talking about. You don't have to wink at the camera, but set them up and pay them off in ways that take a quick shot at the universe itself. But that's about it. I'm certain there were other attempts at jokes made.
She's the only one here carrying around a Skeletor in her closet.
But those were the ones that made any sort of impression on me. It doesn't need to be a Marvel movie quip fest, but someone needs to take a step back, appreciate the absurdity of these characters and universe, and be a hair more tongue-in-cheek about the whole thing. They nearly got there. In episode 3, they have Teela making fun of the campiness and one-liners of the original series.
He-Man had the sense of humor of a teenager who didn't get out much.
That's kinda cute and funny, especially considering that Sarah Michelle Gellar was the one-liner queen back in Buffy, but Teela delivered her own one-liner in the previous episode.
I thought I smelled dirty motor oil.
So the writers can't pretend they are that far removed from the original series. It's like they're saying that style of humor is beneath them, but then are still pulling from that same well. I'm a little torn on the dialogue at large. It's often hammed up without the camp of the original. I don't think it was too egregious, but there were certainly a few small moments that took me out of it, like the death of Roboto. Having the monotone machine sacrifice themselves felt predictable, and they made sure he went out over-explaining why his death was more meaningful than it actually was.
I was no mere machine. I was a miracle.
I feel like I've seen the semi-sentient AI character sacrificing themselves for their human friends like 30 times at this point. In his dying breaths? In his dying circuit firings, he explains how he exceeded his programming and learned how to love or whatever. Like, come on. Show these things. Don't just have him state it as he's dying. That's awful writing. Or a moment like episode 5, where Adam tells them they're trapped here forever.
Whoa. Heroes up here too?
For all eternity, just like you now, because the door to Preternia only opens in one direction.
But then immediately turns around and tells them,
but I think I know how to get you out.
But then he only walks away with Teela and just leaves the rest of them behind with no coordination. You're all over the road here, boys. I don't know what was going on with any of this. Do you want me to care at all? Give it more than one blink of the eye before you say, I'm just kidding, it's totally solvable.
So yes, you're trapped here. But I think I know how to get you out.
What was the point of pretending it was going to be difficult? For every moment like that, there is something quite touching and beautiful, like a monologue from Cringer, or a deep pull from Evil Lynn. So I can't say it's all bad, but some of the bad stuff was really bad. The magic leaving Eternia felt a little cliche, and they didn't do nearly enough with it. It made Evil Lynn and the Sorceress weak, and Orko is straight up dying. I hope they make that all feel more significant later on, but most characters in this universe were punch machines, not magicians, so it's not that impactful. Now, as I wrap up the negative section, I need to share the biggest disappointment and weak point of the show, segueing here slightly. Orko's arc is straight up terrible. Seeing this little blue goofball near dying is something I really didn't want to ever see. It's just kind of gross. The way they made him beg for an adventure was kind of embarrassing rather than touching. They bend over backwards to give him the worst sob story of all time. They spend the end of his life highlighting his feeble existence.
I can't do anything right.
With constant whining and self-pitying that's kind of insufferable. Which, I guess that part is kind of true to the original character in some way, but it's certainly not a joke this time. At least they didn't mean it to be. It's so absurd that it kind of starts to circle back into being a joke. His final sacrifice is probably the worst use of a trope in this entire show. It really started to tip into self-parody.
Look! I'm doing it!
Orko explains, my entire species is dead and I'm the worst. I suck. Ha 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 ha. Funny, right? Did they really have to make this character the literal antithesis of comedic relief? Orko's moment of, look Lynn, I'm doing it, was so cheesy and stupid, and then he just died. So he kind of had his big moment, but it wasn't even big from a storytelling perspective, because the show already killed He-Man and Skeletor. Orko's death ain't topping that. Couldn't they have made him a sad sack to then redeem him? Not just die in a whimper? He just kinda deserved better. Now we can move into the positives, which are the things I really want to talk about. I've looked broadly at the ways this show celebrates what came before, and the incredibly strong cast. Now let's get into some more specific details. I am all in on the idea of redefining these characters and their world. That first episode, while short, is still kinda epic. I don't use that word lightly. I really like the scale of that battle. We experience this time skip and are presented with a new set of rules as to how this world will function through these dramatic changes. I think that's really smart. Like I said, they could have spent more time in the old, but seeing how things were different 5 minutes after the events of that first episode isn't the most interesting part of the story. Jumping ahead a few years until everything is different, it's not that deep, but it's cool the way they mixed it up. I want to include that right at the top because it's kind of the whole thing that this show is doing, and I really appreciate it. Looking at other specifics and small moments, one of my favorites was He-Man stabbing Skeletor and him getting in Adam's face.
Finally use that sword the way it was meant to be used.
It felt very Dark Knight Returns to me, that they've been battling it out for all this time, and He-Man's finally had enough. That's pretty hardcore. It's an obvious example of Kevin Smith's comic book background shining through. One of the best parts about having these well-established characters is letting them kind of naturally guide you towards these big plot points. You can really imagine him and the writers looking forward in time and thinking where this conflict could eventually lead. And that comic bookiness is also why I don't think it mattered that they killed off He-Man and Skeletor in that first episode. People were pissed about that. That's part of why I think the season should have started with a couple more episodes focusing on those two characters. But never for a second did I think they weren't going to bring those two characters back. They went the shock value route, many people didn't appreciate it, but it didn't bother me. Adam being the embodiment of good and heroism is a boring lead character. Infallibility is generally not that interesting. Why not shine some light on supporting characters and create a reason to bring him back into a different world that can then change and redefine what it means for him to be He-Man? That choice is obvious when all he has to do is protect the beacon of good from the devil, the harbinger of doom, whatever this guy is. It's so black and white, and there's only so many places you can go with that. So yes, I think killing He-Man was a positive, not a negative. It's yet another reset where they can now change things however they see fit. I had to smile at the concept of Adam sacrificing himself by summoning the power of Grayskull while already in He-Man form. Have you never tried that before? That's like the first thing I'd do with the power sword, is attempt to become He-Man Man or He-Man. Recognizing that was never in the series before and paying it off in this big climactic moment was very satisfying and creative. It's like, what if the Hulk got so mad that the Hulk became the Hulk, you know? And it's the sort of thing you'd want to do in a finale. So yeah, that fits super well. I always remember it feeling like some big cruel joke in the show that everyone knew who He-Man was except for Teela. It's not literally everyone, but near enough to feel like they're messing with her, somehow not trusting one of their biggest allies, the character whose biggest trait seems to be loyalty. Now, I had issues with the whole storyline of Teela fighting her fear, as I said, but her actual fear being the fact that Adam didn't trust her with his secret, mocking her, feels like a really cool realization of something that was clearly never meant to have a payoff originally. It's just one of those little quirks of the show and existed as a reason for He-Man's identity to be secret to anyone other than the villains, and making that a plot point was smart. But it is kind of weird that Adam sacrificed himself to save the universe, and they make the starting point of Teela's character arc what a victim she is? That makes for a somewhat unrelatable lead in the early part of the season. Yeah, they probably should have told you, and you should probably be upset about it, but it seems like they dialed it up just a bit too far. Maybe they made her so overly bitter strictly so they could have Stephen Root show up for pretty well his only scene and melt her icy heart. The acting on both sides of this speech is really wonderful, and managed to kind of sell me on all of Teela's character arc. So while I thought it was a little over the top, overall it ends up working quite nicely. Every way Teela's story felt a little mishandled, Evil Lynn's arc stood out. I love what they did with that character, having her find herself after escaping from under Skeletor's thumb. How well that was done makes it stand out so much more how poorly Teela's was communicated and shown. They had something really cool there. 2 second fiddle characters from both sides of this epic battle, both finding themselves when free of their figurehead, and it stinks that only one half of that came out very strongly. Nomad Man-at-Arms reminds me of like Hawkeye turning into Ronin. Maybe that was meant to be more of Kevin Smith leaning on comic book influences, the way characters dramatically change and swap out their cool superhero name. It's fun that we saw this studio do their version of the original one-to-one character designs and then create a scenario where they're able to alter and update those costume appearances to fit the new show. I don't think there's a single design update I didn't enjoy. Tila's and Man-at-Arms are pretty abrupt, but I like the way that they kind of had Evil Lynn slowly take apart her costume through the season, so she has an ending point of that new character design as her character developed. I'm so used to seeing cartoons put the characters in the same costume literally all the time, whereas costume design is such a huge part of storytelling. So seeing that play out even in one character, piece by piece, was kind of fantastic. Man, Man-at-Arms is always so current and stylish and of his time. In the 80s, he had a rockin', out loud, in-your-face mustache, and now he's got this salt and pepper beard and a man bun. More like Man-at-Charms. Or some other pun about this character kind of being hot. He's like 70 years old. Considering He-Man used to exclusively throw characters, seeing some actual action in the fighting was rad. It didn't blow me away to the same extent the Castlevania series did, and that was from the same studio, but that might be among some of my favorite fighting animation I've seen in years. But it was a great update on the super restrained 80s style. They actually did a super awesome job with some of the effects animation in particular, like Adam calling the power of Grayskull and turning into He-Man. Oh, that got me excited. They knew it was such a big moment, and they made sure to milk it, and I'm glad they did. I really enjoyed the commitment to including D-tier characters like Stinkor, Scareglow, or Moss Man. I don't really remember their specific episodes back in the day, but it's kind of great seeing them used in a way that fleshes out Eternia, without being entirely concerned with how that could be leveraged to sell you a new toy. Now they just get to think, how does this character behave and operate in this setting? What are their ambitions? What are they after? How powerful are they? I don't know, it's really cool. I would be so down to see them go through that huge toy roster and give as many of them as they can new meaning and purpose. Creating sympathetic villains is all the rage these days. I am so glad they didn't do this with Skeletor. I think Adam should pivot, should change, because he's the one we're usually following along with. But the whole point of this character should be what an irredeemable supervillain they are.
I live to be bad. I care for no one and no one cares for me.
I am fine with them exploring this concept with anyone else. Adam, Evil Lynn, Beastman, go for it. Play around with them. But Skeletor kinda needs to simply be an unflappable tyrant of evil, and the more they commit him to that, the more powerful it would make the eventual storyline of He-Man actually wavering or faltering in his pursuit of good. Everyone in this show had a flat story arc for all those years. It's time to start adding some bumps in there. In general, the handling of these characters and updating them for a post-Skeletor context was really fantastic. There's a void there that needs to be filled. Triclops started a weird tech cult, Lockjaw gets basically killed and then tweaked and upgraded. Beastman goes a little more feral without Skeletor calling the shots. Each of those is so great. When we first met Scareglow, I kind of thought we were meeting our updated Skeletor, who's crazy hardcore and kind of like Skeletor meets Ghost Rider meets the Grim Reaper. I even thought that was Mark Hamill at first.
Asking so much of you.
And the show is smart enough to play around with the low-hanging fruit of having two skeletal-faced supervillains.
Skeletor?
This is such a silly character to adapt, I love it, and they took this goofy gimmick of glowing in the dark and made it into a really cool character design, backed by more great voice acting. When I looked into it, he was one of the last additions to that original toy line, and so he was never featured in the 80s cartoon, and has mostly been absent from most He-Man media. But back in the day, he was marketed with this tagline as being the evil ghost of Skeletor. There's this whole fan speculation that maybe he is Skeletor. So the fact that I thought that while watching this show was in some weird way meant to feel that way. They were totally messing with me in a way that's rooted in this very obscure, poorly defined lore of the original character. How great is that? And if they keep giving us treats like this, then I want them to just keep going, adapt more and more. I love that heaven for these old champions is to live for eternity with a bunch of other mostly naked, muscle-bound dudes in some mystical garden. There's like one lady there, but she's 90 years old and a little crazy, just as if the original version of the show wasn't homoerotic enough. I can't picture them spending their evenings any other way than this.
Everybody grab some grease. Why? Because we're gonna grease up these beefcakes.
Maybe they're just a bunch of platonic tan hunks who rub each other down after wrestling. Okay, it is maybe a bit stupid that they killed He-Man twice. If that's the bit people are upset about, not the first one, then I'm a little more on your side. But on some level, I do like it and respect the balls behind that decision. The second time was actually somehow less expected than the first. He dies once, and you think, oh, it's one of those kind of shows. They're really gonna shake things up and, yeah, you know. Then the second time, it became, oh damn, nobody's really safe, eh? They're gonna do whatever they want. The odds of him dying again in what was seemingly the final triumphant moment of the episode, after him making yet another massive sacrifice, made for a pretty decent twist. I know some people would have rolled their eyes, and you're not wrong, but I was into it. He just gave up his free pass to oily men heaven forever. You would think that would create this new, looming, enduring shadow for the character. They basically just told us he gave away his ticket to happiness and is now destined for either purgatory or maybe even hell. I expected them to drag that out and have that hang over the character, so every situation he gets into for the next X number of seasons creates these additional stakes. Skeletor winning in the end is kind of dope, because he so nearly won in that first episode, as well as nearly winning 300 times prior. Seeing him reach this level of ultimate power is something we've never really seen before. We're breaking the cycle of He-Man, always tossing Skeletor halfway across the planet, blasting off again, rinse and repeat. It may seem like my criticisms of this show are large, and some of them kind of are. It's pretty damning at times. But in general, what they're going for, combined with some huge wins and some really well put together, well earned scenes and big moments, had me totally on board. Before wrapping up my look at part 1, I'm going to throw out some random thoughts I had that didn't really fit elsewhere within the video. Some of them border on positive or negative. I'm just kind of chucking them out there because I wanted to say them even if I didn't have a spot for them. This is not specific to Revelations at all, but the Havoc staff is the most hardcore name for anything ever. I love it so much. A weak moment in episode 1 that almost feels like a failure of pacing and animation rather than writing is that He-Man is finally willing to blast Skeletor through the abdomen with his sword, but then he spent like 2 minutes crawling towards that orb that was gonna end the universe, and everyone just kind of stood there and watched. I feel like something got screwed up on the storyboard there. Why would they do that? In episode 2, they go in search of the Glove of Globula.
Without the Glove of Globula, our followers felt empty.
Which sounds like a name you would come up with if someone said, name a magical glove, right now, go, do it, first thing that comes to your mind, magical glove, now. Oh, I don't know, the Glove of Globula. There you go. And then they ran with that one. They didn't want to workshop that at all, huh? And in the sequence that follows, this is something I just want to make fun of in media at large. If you're a uniformed henchman and you're marching through the halls of your evil lair in either single or double file, you would better make sure that you and your buddy are never the last two in the line. At some point, inevitably, you will be beaten up and left naked, and that's going to be very hard to explain when someone discovers the two of you sleeping together on the floor. At one point, Orko screws up a spell and just nukes a couple of birds. I guess his horrible amateur attempts at magic aren't all quite so innocent and harmless. It was honestly the best thing that Wiener did all season. I don't know what the shit was the point of the B-plot of Beastman, Jackie Briggs, and Roboto fighting zombies. What did that have to do with anything? Why were they even in this episode? The characters or the zombies? And what was the strange setting and non-payoff of the word enlightenment?
How enlightening.
Enlightening.
It suddenly made her decide to just win? Blasting the zombies with light was somehow helpful? Against zombies? What was any of that? Just don't even have a B-plot if you're gonna put that little time and effort into mapping it out. That sub-story of episode 4 might be one of the most confusing, dumbest things of this whole series so far. I love the way they brought in old masters like Hero and Wandar. Like, those goofy characters were created as marketing ploys, were to feed us pieces of lore that never really mattered, and to take that seriously, run with it, and carry that forward into the series in some way, so silly and so great. Hero especially especially. That name is just top tier. For some reason, the forging of the sword weirdly takes place in the Cave of Wonders from Aladdin. It's just all I could think during that scene. One more thing that's less of a random moment, but not a positive or negative, but something I think we need to talk about. I've seen a few people complaining about Skeletor's small line about no woman ever wanting him because of his ugly skeleton face.
Look at my face, child. It has furnished for me a lonely life in which none would have me as a man.
And that being the driving force of his evil origin. If you interpret it that way, yes, that's so stupid, but I don't think that's what he was going for, based on the way Mark delivered the line. And yeah, Mark Hamill liked one of my tweets once, so I think we're on a first name basis. It sounds like this mocking thing, and that he's messing with this character that he blew off just a second prior.
What's wrong with you?
I'm sorry. And you are?
He doesn't care about their opinion, not knowing who she was. It feels like the way Heath Ledger's Joker would tell people how he got his scars. It's like he's introducing himself with this throwaway villain origin, and he's only doing it because she's not worth anything to him. Look at me, I'm the epitome of evil. You want some explanation? You want to put that in a box and define it? Have a reason for it? Oh, it's because I have a skull face. Boo-hoo, how tragic. He's saving that real banter for his true nemesis. I don't think it was him trying to give this character some weird incel backstory. That's only my interpretation, but I was pretty surprised from the few things I did look around, like some Reddit episode discussions. It seemed like people really hated this. I'm really curious what proportion of people fall on either side with their feelings about that scene. I gotta wrap this up. This video is going longer than I expected. They always do. We have 5 more episodes coming. Where is it going? The show reinventing itself and breaking that formula does genuinely leave me wondering what comes next. Not just with a vague sense of curiosity, but through my actual desire to see more of this show and experience where they plan to take this story. While I have a few issues with the show, none of it has turned me off entirely. I'm enjoying it for its concept of continuing on and acting as a proper sequel to a show that never bothered with continuity. So that in itself is interesting enough to me to want to see where they plan to take this. Giving it a personal spin, as I like to do, back when I made fan remakes of Riddle School and Ghost Motel 1, I got to experience what it feels like to play in someone else's sandbox. It's so amazing to riff on established properties, and it always works the best when you respect the source material. And I can see that the creators for Revelation did their research and were cautious about the direction they took things. Some of it may have been bold, but I think there was some real care and artistry there, even if they do smash those toys together a little too hard at times. I now kind of hope that Grayskull and Snake Mountain are decommissioned. Maybe they come back to them and engage with whatever power or person has most recently seized control, but I think I love the idea of a wandering group of heroes trying to use their powers to help all of Eternia rather than defending one cool looking rock. They started the show with this fully retro familiar revival of that old series, and then they immediately fractured it and fleshed out these characters. Maybe in the future they can now more confidently split up the main group for side adventures, so it's not always Adam and Teela only. Because obviously Adam is coming back, Kevin Smith is a comic book guy, characters are killed and revived 3 times a week. We are left off with a cliffhanger of supercharged Skeletor. Obviously the last resort will be to bring back Adam yet again and have him achieve some new height of power. It's like Goku dying and coming back over and over. I'm perfectly okay with that. But it's not going to come till the end of season 1. But if they do leave him out of the show for most of this season, they're only doing so to make room for underdeveloped characters, and they'll eventually bring him back. Man-at-Arms is disgraced, Cringer is still around, Lynn is now a wild card. Once they're done stirring the pot so aggressively, I hope they let things settle a bit and allow for some more chill episodes exploring these characters now that they're on new footing. If they give this some room to breathe and grow and expand the universe, then I'm very into that. I'm excited to get to learn more about these companions, and when Adam eventually returns, the show will be super strongly positioned moving forward. They've backed themselves into a corner by already killing Adam twice. It'll start becoming less impactful if they keep doing that, so they definitely have to tread lightly. I would love to see them joke around a bit more and poke fun at the absurdity of the old without thinking that they're somehow above it. Dial down the moping, depressing, mature storylines a little. Not every character needs this heartbreaking backstory, and killing characters is not the only way to get viewers to care. So I hope they take a bit more care with that. All in all, I am interested in more. I'm so curious to hear what others have to say. I very much want to talk about this.
Now that I've set the stage for what I like and dislike and some of what I'm hoping to see, we can start digging into part 2. And I'll share right away, I liked part 2 even more than part 1.
And that's coming from someone who liked part 1. I'll start off this video spoiler-free and talk about part 2 as broadly as I can, and will give you ample warning before going full spoilers. I still mostly enjoyed part 1 despite its flaws, and now having just binged part 2, I can honestly say I loved it. Maybe that brings the full season average down to something less than love. So as a whole, I really liked this series, and I loved this back half. It is something like a little over 4 hours of TV, so it's a fairly low commitment, and is something I would overall give a light recommendation for. Try it out, decide for yourself. And now, with this part 2, I can definitively say this is not meant for kids. Maybe if you watched some of those other reboots or read comics or other extended lore, it would affect your opinion of this series. I'm lacking that particular perspective. There were commenters on the first video saying they went in knowing nothing about the larger He-Man universe, and they loved it. I thought the series was made for people who only knew the original cartoon, but maybe being free of any baggage or expectations of the original series would make for a better viewing experience, even if you miss some smaller moments without the familiarity and context of that 80s series. Let's start with some spoiler-free reviewing. I'll keep this quite brief. And through that, I'll skip over some categories from that first video, like celebrating the old or highlighting the stellar cast. Those aspects of the show have remained intact, so there's nothing new for me to add there. I went into part 2 with this mid-level bar. I liked the first part and was prepared for the show to come in at that same level, just a soft recommendation and some decently watchable TV. But oh man, part 2 works better than part 1 on most levels. Starting off, there is far more action throughout, and even the worst action sequence of this part rivals the best scene in part 1. So that is an immediate standout that I think people will be thrilled to hear. Several fights feel like they're coming straight out of Dragon Ball Z, another thing I grew up with. Did they weirdly slip a survey in front of me and make a show catered specifically to my interests without me knowing? I would believe that actually happened if I didn't skip literally every YouTube survey that they've ever put in front of me. Does anyone actually answer these? The storytelling here feels a little less fractured as the characters exist in two main groups, so we get to see the heroes and the villains, without stories being cut up and wedged back together too much. There's a little less juggling of the often wasted B and C plots. Part 2 gets right to it and tells one main story the whole time. There are some small offshoots, but not ones that drag down the narrative, as was sometimes seen in Part 1. It was pretty impressive that they managed to have filler content when there was only 5 episodes. Even if this Part 2 story potentially bites off more than it can chew at times, it feels more coherent. It's more like a 3-act movie rather than 5 episodes of TV. This is not something that necessarily needed to be addressed, but since I mentioned it in the last video, the humor here is notably better. They have a few more tongue-in-cheek digs at the old show that feel good-humored, especially the way they now lean on the camp of Skeletor more, having him ham it up and deliver corny-ass lines that just made me smile.
Let him marinate in his tears until I amputate his man-at-arms.
That was totally missing in Part 1, I guess mostly because Skeletor was missing, and it really balances the tone of the show much better. And above all else, Part 2 had like 7 major oh shit moments that literally shocked and amazed me. They were designed to do that. So, maybe they're less earned than big reveals in other shows, and I'm just some knuckle-dragging watcher who's super susceptible to that sort of thing. But those twists, power shifts, reveals, and more all felt like they were the reason the show was made. It was ambitious. You'd be picking your jaw up from one thing, and 15 minutes later, something else absolutely bonkers happens and stuns all over again. An important point for people who disliked the lack of Adam and Skeletor, but mostly Adam in part 1, that is addressed and handled much better here. And on the flip side, I'm very frustrated with where they eventually took Teela in a once promising character arc. Evil Lynn was a little bit iffy, but Teela was the real flop. My major hangups for this part are that there are still pacing issues present, if not worse than ever, and character development is largely sidelined, which, kinda isn't great. It makes the show really enjoyable and like eating a big thing of cotton candy, but we're kinda missing the steak to savor. If they never make more of this show, then yeah, hot damn, it was a lot of fun. If they try to make several seasons, I think they're gonna wish they spent a little bit more time laying some foundations in this early part of the show. Okay, I'm too excited about this. I need to move into spoiler territory because that's the stuff I really want to talk about. It's way too difficult to discuss this without sharing the specifics, and it's even harder to find footage to pull that doesn't spoil anything. I may have used stuff from part 1 just to save myself that risk. First up, the positives, the stuff I really liked. But now is also the time that you should click away if you don't want major plot points spoiled, because I basically have to discuss all of them. This part was nothing but big plot points. Okay, you ready? You gone if you don't want a spoiler? I'm going for it. Right away, Adam didn't die. I made a whole thing in the last video about Adam dying twice, and that they'd bring him back in time for the season finale. Nope, Teela actually managed to save him, and Adam becomes a major player for the rest of this season. Even if the show does still center on Teela and Lynn a little more than anyone else, Adam is maybe as big of a character as them here, which means across the series, he's not the main character, but he definitely is in part 2. Not only does Adam come back, we get what is essentially He-Man Man, the thing that I joked about in the previous video.
See, the sword is just the conduit, but the spark? That was always me.
Although I think they call him Savage He-Man. We learn that the sword actually channels and tamps down the power of Grayskull, and without it, Adam turns into this freakazoid combination of the Hulk, Tarzan, and Rage Mode Broly. This is something I never knew I wanted, but he is wild, fierce, and so incredible to see in action. Almost the entirety of episode 2 is him just ripping shit apart, and in the process of blasting through everything in a totally unstoppable way, as Skeletor puts it, he is power incarnate. This Adam rips apart loads of this skeleton horde, which means he's murdering things that were civilians like a moment before. I guess they skipped trying to figure out if they could save those people. He even threatens his own father. Yeah, it's intense. It's out of character, but they're establishing that Adam hates being in this form. He doesn't want to be like this. It was a very temporary risk and necessity, so you don't have to worry about him busting it out all the time. But this is the best action sequence of the whole series. It's so long and just non-stop. It's far closer to the action scene in Castlevania. This is what I was expecting from that studio. It's like Cell versus Broly. It's so damned fun to watch. I know people will think that this being ended with a speech and a hug is lame, but Adam has always been centered around avoiding a fight. He doesn't even really like turning into He-Man, let alone this new savage form. And going back to the old series, Randor was horrible to Adam, always calling him lazy and never really showing any form of love for him. So now that he finally has his son back, having him express his pride in and love for Adam was a touching payoff. Through this, Adam is able to shed this form, reject it, and wishes to never use it again. I love the way they laced in commentary from different characters that really eloquently define what the 80s version of He-Man stood for. Skeletor criticizes him for having more power than he ever let on, and using it to only police him.
You abuse this power. You hid it away, and only ever called upon it to police me.
While Duncan explained the restraint Adam showed.
But he only chose to call it down when someone else needed it. He gave it away. That's what made him a hero.
This is what He-Man has always been about, and it expands on the PSA-style life lessons into a more well-rounded character with incredible morals. If your biggest issue with this series was a lack of He-Man and Adam, and a lessening of what he stood for,
but why?
Because I want you to know what saving the universe feels like.
This is really well handled in part 2. It's no longer just carrying forward the characters and telling unique stories. They're attempting to tie in those same motivations and lessons in a more mature context. This is what Kevin Smith meant when he said the show is still about Adam and about He-Man. Yes, he's less present, still a major player, but central to the biggest takeaways from the season. And going hand in hand with the return of Adam, Skeletor is back, and we obviously get to see much more of him in part 2.
Adam is the strongest man I've ever known.
Until now.
Mark Hamill lives up to his name and Hamills it up. Eh? I stayed up all night writing that joke. Starting right from where we left off, he recites poetry with a sinister glee that you can't help but love.
All hope lost, the champion dead, she begged them, find the sword!
He's cracking jokes all throughout the season in this dark and twisted manner. It breathes a humor into the show while honoring the silly camp of the 80s.
Your heroics are hilarious to me. You want a fighty fight?
Yet it's simultaneously the most dark and twisted form of Skeletor I've ever seen.
I can unmake you with a thought.
I love the layers it adds to this power-hungry maniac, seeing him be totally unhinged. It's such a perfect evolution of the character, I love it. Skeletor is never satisfied with what he has, and makes every choice in pursuit of killing He-Man. Everyone around him is annoyed by him that this is all he seems to care about. In fact, I generally love the implication that everyone actively hates Skeletor. All his henchmen are constantly trying to betray and get out from under him. It makes sense. He's a dick. The joking, cackling, straight-up evil villain who defines his existence through his nemesis with a lovesick right-hand woman he emotionally abuses? Mark Hamill really is typecast, isn't he? And similar to the Joker, Skeletor cannot bring himself to kill He-Man when the time comes. Maybe he could have done it, but he makes excuses, like there being more secrets to be uncovered. That eternal battle will always rage on, even if the rivalry is entirely one-sided. He'll never back down from it. That's why they used to battle it out for whatever 300 episodes before, and it's why it's continued on now. The best thing part 2 does, and I know some people are going to dislike this aspect, and I get the critiques, but I've really enjoyed the constant arms race of power. Seriously, the dynamic changes twice per episode. It borders on being a little too much. But that rate of shifting keeps things fresh and reveals a lot of interesting things about the characters involved. Skeletor becomes Power Skeletor, Adam becomes He-Man Man, Skeletor makes Evil Lyn into the new sorceress. How does he do it? I don't know. Don't think too hard on it. They probably should have explained it. I guess because he's basically a god at that point and there was the void of the sorceress that needed to be filled. Just a light critique sprinkled in there. But then this Dark Lyn becomes God Lyn. Beastman becomes Battle Beastman. Totally amazing, by the way. And while we're doing side notes, I love that they actually gave Beastman a hair of depth. He's not a total moron, he has culture and he has opinions. Teela becomes the new good sorceress, and I don't even know, I might be missing some even. And at the very end, they pay off the tech cult from part 1 by setting up this possible nanobot Skeletor. Seriously, that stuff from before felt like a total throwaway and just some weird scheme from Triclops to try and find a way to rise to power. But then we come all the way back to it in a way that actually matters, where the motherboard is a real thing. It's non-stop, and every one of these kinda had my jaw on the floor. But it is one of the reasons why I feel like this part felt rushed. Did we really need every character to undergo 2 massive changes in only 5 episodes? Maybe not. But if we never get another season of this show, then at least they went out with a bang. I do wonder about Lyn's overall arc through this series. She had a really good one in part 1 and another good one in part 2, but they're very much at odds with one another. It's not a very smooth progression. She goes from evil to regular Lyn, then immediately back to evil again, and doubles down on that path. It feels like it's undoing some of that part 1 character development, but I think they do attempt to show her internal conflict. They just should have spent more time on that. Again, too few episodes, too fast of pacing. I understand her going back to Skeletor, it's out of genuine fear, and she's just lost her certainty of whether any of the time she thought she spent alone for the last however long was actually time making her own decisions.
I fed off you like a dick, slowly regrowing my body from yours.
She now knows Skeletor was there the entire time. Can she really even count that as her own free will? He was leeching off of her and influencing her when he could. So the idea that that kind of shatters her will and she just crawls straight back to him makes sense. Her allegiance to him suddenly feels inevitable and inescapable. Pair that with the scene of her staring into the void and warping her brain, and she concludes that both her choices and those of the world are meaningless. So everything is pain and chaos and needs to be destroyed. Maybe that's a flimsy motivation. Most characters' motivation for destroying the universe usually is. But I really needed to see that play out over like a season, not one episode. It loses a lot of its impact when it comes hot on the heels of her half-complete redemption arc. But hey, the power struggle and what she wants to do with it, showing Skeletor that his ambition is too small. Yeah, I'm on board with that. Maybe she takes away the sword from Skeletor a little too easily. Like, she has a vast history of double-crossing him all the time. So I'm a little iffy on that. But at that moment, Skeletor feels invincible and assumes that he has complete control over her. And she immediately shoves it in his face how stupid he's always been.
Simple, predictable little man.
So I don't mind it so much, even though I know many will. He's this power-hungry near god who thinks he deserves everything. Why can't he have his cake and bang it too? Which, yeah, the implications of sex in a He-Man show are a little out there. I don't know if I really needed to see any of that. Skeletor's always been a bit of a clown. The fact that he's deceived so easily, I think it kind of checks out. I mostly like her taking a place of ultimate power, but there were some rocky steps taken to get us there. Overall, it remains in the positive category. I love that near immediately, Lynn essentially becomes Skeletor.
And turn you into my little battle dog, saddle and all.
You sound just like him.
There is this theme that's along the lines of absolute power corrupts absolutely. Skeletor always wanted more. Juiced up Adam became a danger. And as soon as she has power, she berates and belittles everyone like Skeletor always did.
The bumbling idiocies of the past will no longer be tolerated.
Poking fun at their incompetence when present in the old show was done in a way I really like. A side note, her bat outfit for the Dark Sorceress is just glorious. Instead of it being like an eagle or falcon for the good sorceress, she gets to be this badass goth witch, and I think it's perfect. Although I do have to laugh at her getting like 12 redesigns across 10 episodes. It's a bit much, even though I think it's all quite fun. I've seen people poke fun of the fact that all these characters' hairstyles change with each power upgrade. Back in the original show, He-Man and Adam always shared a haircut, so that was never really an established thing. But I don't know, just think of a Super Saiyan's hair turning yellow. It's the same idea. It's a weird nitpicky thing to take issue with. Didn't bother me. And while I'm talking about nitpicking, I am so sick of hearing people say that they think that this is disgusting, or evil Lynn shouldn't have muscles, oh, it's so butch, and whatever. These characters are masters of the universe, so what if they beef up Evil Lynn a little bit? She looks hardcore. These people are never once going to criticize the fact that Adam suddenly puts on 500 pounds of muscle when he becomes He-Man. What do you care if she gains 1 inch on her bicep? Those are weak criticisms. But at least every time I hear people bring them up, I can immediately identify people whose opinions I can discount. I already laced in some of the dope lines from Duncan in this season, but he was fantastic all around, especially in this part. Although he was mostly locked up in a jail with this octopus creature, so he was kinda underutilized, but he'd pop in here and there and drop straight facts.
Nobody here fears you, evil Lynn. We all pity you.
I love the idea of interpreting the perceptions we as the audience would have had of these characters and then implying that that's a shared perspective with the good guys of the story. That's a really cool way to bring it all together. Plus, they lightly expand on Duncan's relationship with the sorceress and the implications of the sacrifice she made for the good of the universe. Also, it's just damn good fun to have Lena Headey and Liam Cunningham share an extended scene together. Rather fitting of a show that has 2 Game of Thrones alumni, this part of the season is notably more mature. From the earliest moments, we have characters battered and bleeding. I don't think we ever had that in part 1. And like I mentioned, Adam totally kills civilians. I mean, Skeletor kinda killed them first, maybe? But they don't even consider trying to save them. Dingus and Kingus over here get blasted. Then the characters try to console themselves that they'll live on Preternia, their version of heaven. Then Skeletor saunters in and is all, nope, lol, and then banished their souls to hell just like that, all at once showing his command of life, death, and the afterlife, and that there's no peace in death. Without spoiling them, there are actually several more deaths in this part, each of which hit harder than anything that came in part 1. This show is getting pretty dramatic. Later on, when Lynn has the power, she kills Heaven.
Then she must have killed Skeletor.
She just killed everyone in heaven!
Now, the dialogue surrounding that moment is a little on the nose, but the actual act of it is crazy. In a world where characters have lived knowing that there is an afterlife, so they can rest after a life of pain, Lynn takes that all away. That's wild. I don't know if I've seen that in a show before. Lynn even has her own tragic backstory of her cannibal parents. I'm not making that up. This show really didn't shy away from anything non-kid friendly. Even if it borders on forced or a little gratuitous, I liked that story beat within the context of the season. I'll repeat that while I love the show now more than ever, it means they have totally and absolutely cut off younger age groups. Maybe that's a mistake with a property like He-Man, but if they made it too kid-friendly, I probably wouldn't be that into it, so I guess you gotta choose a demographic. Now, I can mock a line like the one about killing Heaven, but part 2 had some great exchanges between characters, several different lines that were more memorable than anything from part 1, and then this absolutely devastating line from Lynn to Skeletor.
And there isn't enough blood in your body to wash my hands of you.
That was really rolling around in my head after she delivered it. Pardon me, but that is so fucking sick. Holy crap, that's the most metal shit I've ever heard. I do enjoy the way pieces were moved around this season, even if it was almost entirely for the sake of motivating action rather than plot or character development. And I should save myself some time and just say there's a big asterisk next to almost every single point I bring up that it happened probably too fast. With a bit of ironic timing, we have a team up of Skeletor and Adam.
At this point, I think we'd welcome any help we can get. From anyone.
Working together out of circumstance, that's always a riot. Give these characters an excuse to bounce off each other in a way we wouldn't typically see. That reveal borders on a lazy joke to make, but I kind of enjoy it when you introduce it in such an on-the-nose way just once in a whole season. It's a good payoff. It's so amazing to see Skeletor mock Adam for his plan basically being to talk.
Ask her nicely to please stop destroying the universe. Oh my god, we are.
Then, when fighting Lynn, the two laugh at him together for being so naive.
Oh, don't tell me you came here to talk.
I know! It's ridiculous, right?
It shows us both their frame of mind while reinforcing what a good guy Adam is. And it ties in the fact that He-Man really couldn't fight in the old cartoons. He's the toughest guy around, but chooses to avoid the fight when he can and would rather use his words. It's like he's carrying forward the lessons he would have taught kids 40 years ago. There's a moment during the big battle when everything seems so bleak, and on the first light of the 5th day, everyone looks off to the east. You know, something like that. There's this scarf that's floating around, kind of assisting. I was so confused, with no clue where this was going. I don't know how I didn't see it coming. We have the big reveal. It's basically Orko the White. Oh, they really got me. It makes me almost want to entirely forgive what a pathetic sad sack they made him in part 1. Almost. They still gave him an overly sad arc and turned his death into a joke, but the payoff is borderline worth it. I loved watching him kick ass, especially with the use of sound effects straight from the 80s cartoon. Although, it was weird to have him fight in 2 battles at once. Why do it that way? You couldn't have another character step up to help fight? Layer in one more payoff? But I did love that they reintroduced his crappy bubble from episode 1, bringing it up in this giant climactic battle, which itself is also bringing the series full circle. Reconnecting to episode 1, bringing back Orko these small moments, it enhances that first episode as well as the full season. I still think his death was milked a little hard and could have been treated better, but his return was pretty triumphant, and the character felt a little closer to how we remembered him. There are some other great character moments from pretty well everyone, even if they are light on the actual development. Look at something like Skeletor practically begging Lynn to be spared.
Don't kill me, Lynn! Don't kill me!
And for a second, I thought she might actually kill him. I know some might not like it, but I dig that the show managed to raise the stakes that high that I believed that was a possibility.
I didn't really touch on the animation in the previous video. I said some of the effects were good, but there wasn't really a lot to specifically point to.
They step it up like crazy in part 2. The effects, settings, designs, landscapes, and backgrounds had loads of gorgeous examples. This season was actually a treat to look at, and there were a few musical sections that really stood out as well and got me fired up. I'm kind of gushing at this point. Maybe it's time to take things back down a notch. I can take a step back and look at the criticisms I had for this season. I'm not doing the positivity sandwich this time around because my criticisms are much lighter for part 2. The lack of character development and pacing issues kind of permeate the whole thing, but honestly, those were some of the easier things to overlook. When there's this much action and big moments, it still made the show super enjoyable.
Yes, I would rather the show handled those things better, but some of that was already better in part 1, and it's not like it was 100% absent here. Zooming in a little bit more on things that are less easily forgivable include the more specific characters and how they were handled and underdeveloped. Part 1 put a lot of time into showing us new sides of Teela and Lynn. We even have a little bit for characters like Beastman and Duncan. A little, not much. Definitely not this girl. I think her name was Adra? Oh no, as I'm saying it, Andra. I'm like 90% confident in that, but that's how little time we spent with this character. I can never remember her name because they did nothing with her the whole series. Really all I know is she's Teela's friend, and I only know that because they tell us, never show it. Based on the way the show is presented, I would assume she's like a sidekick. She's just kind of in the background often and doesn't really contribute ever. And she became the new man-at-arms basically because she was at the right place at the right time? Yeah, that's abysmally handled. It's not even fair to say she's the worst character of the show because they never even made her into a character. This is something the show probably should catch some flack for. It's a lip service diversity character who gets sidelined through the entire adventure and was never treated with any significance. And they probably should be called out on that BS. I am still severely disappointed at how little attention Cringer was paid. He had a big, brave moment that was never built to. Cringer being heroic without turning into Battle Cat should have been a massive moment and the completion of his own character arc. I'm not even sure if him and Adam ever speak directly. That is so stupid. It's a critical character to the original series, and they treated him like a pet. I have a lot of trouble looking past that. The only real character development that happens for anyone this season is just them hugging it out. Yes, we have micro advancements in characters, but mostly what we had was Randor apologizing to Adam, Adam apologizing to Randor, Teela apologizing to Randor, Randor apologizing to Teela, Adam apologizing to Marlena, Marlena apologizing to Randor, Adam apologizing to Teela. In every instance they hug, they're instantly forgiven, we move on. I don't know. There are like 8 more moments of characters basically stating their feelings and everyone accepting it. This is the main reason the show needed more episodes. If they wanted to tackle all this, they needed like 15 to 20 episodes. But would the show have been as fun and memorable if it were all spaced out? That's what I've been wondering. Maybe not on a first watch, but I think this show's long-term staying power and rewatchability would be improved by mixing all these elements together with better spacing and pacing. For the harshest criticism I have of part 2,
I hate how they established how meaningful the sorceress's sacrifice really was. She gave up her family and freedom to protect Grayskull. She denied herself the ability to let her daughter know who she was, even when they saw each other on a regular basis. That sacrifice made this flat beacon of good character into someone much more humanized. It made us really feel sorry for both her and Tila and what they missed out on. After establishing how huge the sorceress's sacrifice is, Tila storms in and said, "No thanks. I'm gonna enter some cheat codes, create my own loophole, and then instantly exploit it."
So, you're the first sorceress who can leave Grayskull.
Somehow circumventing the curse of being bound to the castle? Something that shackled the sorceress for all those years and was just like an episode prior leveraged against evil Lynn.
You are bound forevermore to the halls of Grayskull.
So, the sorceress could have done that too? And instead wasted her life in isolation? Is that really the message we want to send? It was all a little too easy and convenient for her. They just did that with Scareglow in part 1, where Tila just makes her own rules on the spot and for whatever reason that works out for her? What is with this rush to make Tila a superpowered character? I like all these story beats, but they are coming way too fast. Her ending season 2 as the sorceress and finding a way to free herself of the castle by season 3, that would be great. Instead, she gives some speech that ends up coming across worse than one of those cheesy PSAs from the old series talking about friendship. I don't use this word often, but cringe. Earlier to this, on her first attempt to send a message out to all of Eternia, she gets it right?
I know for a fact that it worked, Tila. Because I heard you.
That was totally unearned as well. Why are they just giving everything to this character? I like Tila and the direction they were going, but I hate the way they've handled her power discovery and use. This is especially stupid when they established that she was a tech person in season 1. She actively rejected the use of magic.
You just need better tech. I tracked it with this, and this wasn't conjured by some wizard. It was hand-built by an engineer.
Having her reconcile the fact that the sorceress was her mother should have been huge. Then she suddenly gets all the power with zero sacrifice because she has friends? Nah. This is now my most hated plot point of the whole series. Orko's whimper got redeemed, and it was now replaced with this. It's so rushed and unsatisfying. And it really undoes a lot of the better character work they had going for Tila. It's just frustrating. While I'm thinking of Orko, I really think keeping Orko around past his redemption was a last-minute decision. I really liked the idea that Tila fixing everything inadvertently would have sent Orko away again.
No! Orko, I didn't mean to...
It's okay, Tila.
These powers are new to her, and she realizes at the same time the audience does that patching things up means she's taking away her friend's new life. That would have been a brilliant send-off, having him really come to terms with it, have some proper goodbyes, and maybe leave us with this twinkle of a possibility that we'll see him again one day. But then Lynn just holds his arm and he's good? Why? How was it that easy? It bothered me at the start of the season when she stopped Duncan from teleporting by putting a hand on his shoulder, but this is even worse. What is this? Why can she do it? She has the power of never letting go. And while we're at it, I hate that everyone just instantly forgives Lynn and lets her go about her life. She's not locked up for eternity or taken down a Subternia or something. You'd think some higher up would take issue with her zapping away Preternia. Nope, they don't address that. Or Orko sticking around on this plane. We're not even going to attempt to explain any of that, huh? Those are two choices I do not understand. I think they may have been some late in production rewrites because it's at odds with the rest of the series and feels totally cheap. Talking about humanization, part 2 did a fair amount of that, and it was more often good than bad. There's a moment where Adam realizes his death ended his parents' marriage. He makes a bad joke with Tila.
Get me to Grayskull, Cabby, and make it snappy!
And we see that maybe his childish sense of humor has been a coping mechanism his whole life. It was a brief moment, and I wish there was a little more room for that in this season. And besides, then his parents hug and make up and I think get back together. So yeah, we undid that plot point pretty quickly with another hug and forgive. People really hated the line about killing Heaven. I think the worst offender is that they used both these lines.
We have the power.
You have the power.
If you're gonna have a big "We Are Groot" moment, you only really get to do that once. I think they probably should have picked one of these and cut the other. Keeping the "you have the power" makes a lot more sense and feels like a good positive take-home message. And now we can move on to a lighter section, a part of these videos I really like doing, some of my random thoughts. These are just small moments that I wanted to acknowledge that didn't quite fit under the previous umbrellas, even though they were mostly things I liked. Can this please become a meme?
I'd sure like to fist him.
They knew what they were doing there. I mean, other than the literal sex scene, yeah, there's a bit of innuendo throughout the season. I think they assume parents would have decided by the end of part 1 if they want their kids to continue watching this show, because the violence, blood, innuendos didn't really rear its head until part 2. So while it probably didn't need to be here at all, I guess they showed some restraint in that regard. Speaking of the sex scene, I was a little shocked that this show decided to confirm that Lynn and Skeletor definitely bang. They then kind of just mash teeth together, and Skeletor makes a boner joke?
I'm happy you took my point.
I don't know how to feel about any of that. I think bad? Adam tying in the use of...
What kind of fabulous secret powers would be revealed to me if I didn't have the sword?
Oh, that's just... Mwah. It's such a corny 80s line, and the fact that they used it in a way that felt natural was unexpected and delightful. I was doing mental fist pumps after that one. Savage He-Man kills a Manticore, a monster seen in the original series. This is a perfect little moment for fans of the original series. It will mean little to anyone else, but it's a grim and amazing detail to include. There's such a wealth of things to pull from. I love little moments like this. I think my favorite gag from the whole season was when Pig Boy and what's his name were the only two henchmen available to help.
When it comes to henchmen, they've reached the bottom of the barrel!
The idea of bringing in these stupid, garbage, D-tier henchmen and layering on jokes at their expense, that works so well when the series infamously had 1,000 characters. Nobody is remotely worried about fighting these two. They even attempt to make a retort and fail at that as well.
Yeah, well, you look like a... We don't do puns! Kill him!
These henchmen are so shitty that they both lack any good powers and are incapable of keeping up with the banter. They suck on every level, making it even more funny. Skeletor turning the Havoc staff into a scythe was gnarly. That's all I have to say on that. While I didn't like what they did with this character and her rapid promotion, I did get a chuckle that the king kind of jokes that he lucked out that this rando that he made lieutenant is actually a good fighter.
She was a good hire.
Yeah, it really was an impulse decision and it paid great dividends. In the opening scene of part 2, we see a young Duncan and young Sorceress. They really did turn him into a hot beefcake, eh? As if the salt and pepper man bun dad at arms wasn't weirdly hot enough. What a stone cold lady killer.
I'd sure like to fist him.
I cannot believe they brought in Ram Man. I always thought he was the most mockable character, and his arrival was actually kind of epic. I don't know how they made me like this doofus with about 6 seconds of screen time, but he kind of was like the next largest character missing, so it was exciting to see.
Woohoo! It was hot in that plane.
And waiting for the credits, I was floored to see that it was Danny Trejo.
Come on, E-Man. Your mommy's worried about you.
Who would have guessed? That's a wonderful cameo. And one semi-major plot point to rip on, the celestial apex that would beef up Skeletor's power comes out of nowhere. I liked the way it led into Lynn staring into the void and basically breaking her back down to an evil nihilist. The scale of it was awesome and appropriate. So I'm split on it in those ways. It doesn't get to end up positive or negative. I think it just needed to be introduced sooner, maybe as a good thing, something the sorceress is trying to take advantage of, and then Skeletor is now exploiting it. I don't know. There's room for stuff like that. It just can't be brought in with no notice whatsoever like 5 minutes before it's meant to be relevant. At this point, I've blathered on this series well and truly long enough. Let's get into some final thoughts. I think this show is nearly at a point of what it was always meant to be. The massive action sequences, power struggles, lore expansion, cosmic pondering, integrated camp, and big battles were all so wonderful. There's a desperate need to improve pacing. Slowing things down would give us some time to better explore characters other than Teela and Lynn. They were the only two who were really developed meaningfully, and even they were kind of ignored in part 2. They're at the center, but they just don't grow a lot. Especially upon seeing where all the stories ended, I do feel some of it could have been handled better. They pull Lynn to the good side, she goes right back. That's fine, but they presented it as if she only just now learned Skeletor sucks, rather than her lesson being that the good side has something to offer. And then somehow she ended up good anyways and everyone was fine with that? You can't rubber band characters this aggressively. These need to be long, winding roads. If Tila's destiny was to become the next sorceress, they could have spent some time setting that up. She clearly had other baggage and stuff to work through, so that could all remain, but I'd like to have seen more seeds lain and have it take longer to get there. Castlevania did this much better, plotting things along, balancing the characters with the plot and the big action sequences. They really could take a page out of that book. Looking at 2 opening scenes. In episode 6, we explore Duncan and the sorceress's relationship at the moment of her sacrifice. And episode 10, we have Tila getting ready to make her own sacrifice. I wish both these scenes were 2 or 3 times longer. The first is emotional and touching, and the other is genuinely quite beautiful. Why not take the time to revel in these moments? That's what I'd like to see the show improve upon. Don't race to the next big fight or hell yeah moment. I live for those. I'm right there with you. But they're missing out on what could really make this show a standout. They seemingly haven't left themselves a lot of room for a next season, if it even gets one. Every major character had a power boost and wielded the power of Grayskull at least one point. Where do we go from there? I mean, that's their problem to figure out, but they really started to create a few corners with their writing. But I did like the motherboard tease with the music chanting her name and Skeletor seemingly getting prepped for his next big power boost. I want to see where that goes. Now, this show can't do the PSAs of the original, but they can still have characters learn something that then teaches the audience. There's pieces of that and reminders of the old, and the season basically showed that forgiveness is good, not much else. There's definitely a lot of room for more of that if they had navigated it a little more deftly. Show some of these things rather than just having characters like Duncan tell us they're true. Maybe I'm a big dumb brute who's susceptible to the cool moments, allowing me to overlook some of the other flaws of this series, but I had a whole heap of fun, especially with part 2. And if they can balance it all out, spend a bit more time on development and laying out the all-important whys for many of the things they include, the show could be great. And that's why I kind of loved part 2. If I had to attach numbers to it, part 1 felt like a 6 out of 10. I liked more than I disliked, but it was mostly about the potential I saw. This season was like an 8 out of 10. I was excited and I had a blast, even with some major hangups. So the whole series gets like a 7 out of 10, positive if not overwhelmingly so, but a series I still recommend and want to see more of. I'm genuinely surprised they moved ahead with any sort of season 2 or continuation considering all the controversy surrounding this season. I think it's totally stupid how they've chosen to name it as a new thing. Maybe that'll make more sense once it drops, but that's officially a week away and we still don't even know if they're releasing it in 1 or 2 parts. They're clearly kinda hanging this one out to dry and I pretty well assume Revolution is gonna be the last we see in this canon, if they do release it in 2 parts. Having now brought these 2 old videos together, I think I'll probably do the same and wait for the entirety of Revolution to have aired, and then talk about it all at once, rather than having kind of the weird stutter and stops revisiting different characters and story arcs and things the way I had to in this video. And if the full season drops all at once, well then I've got some work to do. I'm glad I was able to bring this video back in some form ahead of the release of Revolution. I'm really excited to talk about all this. You'll have to let me know what you liked and disliked about this series and whether you're looking forward to the sequel. Thank you all so much for checking it out. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you again soon.